The most expensive mistake in business is laughing before you understand what is standing in front of you. The ballroom of the Grand Lexington Hotel shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers and golden light as some of the most powerful people in international finance gathered for what was supposed to be a routine contract negotiation. Manhattan stretched beyond towering glass windows, its skyline glowing beneath the late afternoon sun. Waiters moved quietly between tables. Executives reviewed documents. Interpreters whispered translations through headsets. At the center of it all stood William Sterling, founder and chief executive of Sterling Global Investments, a man whose name appeared regularly on magazine covers and financial news networks. At 42, William had built an empire that stretched across continents. He was accustomed to solving problems quickly. He was not accustomed to being told something could not be done. Yet that was exactly what had happened. Around a polished conference table, legal teams and language specialists stared helplessly at a 20-page document recently delivered by a delegation from a remote region overseas. The contract was essential to a proposed investment worth nearly $3 billion. There was only one problem. A crucial section had been written using an obscure dialect that none of the hired experts could confidently interpret. "We need certainty," Williams said, glancing around the room. "Not guesses." An uncomfortable silence followed. One consultant adjusted his glasses. Another flipped through reference materials. Nobody offered a solution. Frustration began spreading across the room. Time was running out. The foreign delegation expected an answer before the end of the evening. Without one, months of negotiations could collapse. Near the back of the ballroom, seated at a small table beside the catering entrance, a woman quietly closed the book she had been reading. Nia Carter had spent most of the afternoon helping conference staff with language support and administrative tasks. She was not part of the executive team. She was not listed among the featured translators. Most people had barely noticed her. Wearing a simple navy blazer and carrying a worn leather notebook, she looked entirely out of place among the luxury suits and designer accessories surrounding her. Yet she had been listening. Slowly, she stood and approached the conference area. Several executives glanced at her with mild confusion. William barely looked up. "Excuse me," Nia said calmly. "I believe I can translate that section." The room fell silent. William finally raised his eyes. "You can." Nia nodded. "For $600. For a brief moment, nobody reacted. Then laughter erupted from several corners of the room. One attorney nearly choked on his coffee. Another executive shook his head and smiled. Even members of the foreign delegation exchanged amused looks. William leaned back in his chair. "You are telling me that a room full of specialists cannot solve this problem, but you can?" Nia remained perfectly composed. "That is what I am saying." More laughter followed. William studied her for a moment. There was no arrogance in her expression, no desperation, no attempt to impress anyone. She simply looked certain. Somehow, that confidence annoyed him. $600? He repeated. "That is your price?" "Yes." "And if you are wrong?" Nia shrugged gently. "Then you owe me nothing." The simplicity of the answer caught him off guard. Around the room, people continued smiling. Some clearly expected the conversation to end there. William glanced at the document, then back at the woman standing before him. Curiosity began replacing irritation. "Fine," he said at last. "You have 5 minutes." Nia stepped forward and accepted the contract. As her eyes moved across the unfamiliar text, the room settled into silence once again. Nobody noticed the subtle change in the expressions of the foreign delegates. Nobody noticed the way one elderly representative suddenly sat upright in his chair. And nobody, especially William Sterling, had any idea that the next few minutes were about to change far more than a business deal. The ballroom remained silent as Nia Carter turned the pages of the contract. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors while dozens of executives watched. With varying degrees of amusement and skepticism, William Sterling folded his arms and leaned back in his chair. Around him, members of his legal team exchanged knowing looks. Most expected the experiment to end quickly. After all, specialists with advanced degrees had already examined the document. The idea that a woman who had spent the day assisting conference staff could solve the problem seemed almost absurd. Nia, however, appeared completely unaffected by the attention. Her eyes moved steadily across the text. Every now and then she made a note inside her worn leather notebook. The foreign delegation watched her closely. Unlike the executives, they were not smiling. Several appeared curious. One elderly representative sitting near the end of the table seemed particularly interested. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Nobody interrupted her. Finally, Nia closed the document and looked toward William. The problem is not the dialect, she said calmly. The problem is that everyone has been translating it as a legal document. William raised an eyebrow. It is a legal document. Partly, Nia replied. But the section causing confusion was never intended to function as a legal clause. A few attorneys exchanged puzzled looks. William gestured for her to continue. Nia turned toward the foreign delegation. Then, to the surprise of everyone present, she began speaking in their language. Not slowly, not cautiously, fluently. The room immediately fell still. Several delegates sat upright. One man smiled in obvious surprise. Nia continued for nearly a minute before switching seamlessly into a second language. Then a third. William felt his expression harden. This was not what he had expected. Around the room, amusement disappeared. Curiosity replaced it. Nia eventually returned to English. The disputed paragraph references a historical proverb, she explained. It was written using a regional variation that combines legal terminology with cultural symbolism. One attorney frowned. That makes no sense. The elderly delegate responded immediately in his native language. Nia translated without hesitation. He says it makes perfect sense if you understand the region where the agreement originated. The delegate nodded enthusiastically. Several representatives began speaking at once. Nia listened carefully before translating each response. William watched the exchange in disbelief. For the first time all afternoon, the delegation looked relaxed. They were no longer correcting misunderstandings. They were having an actual conversation. Then Nia pointed toward a specific sentence near the center of the document. This is the section everyone keeps mistranslating. She placed the contract on the table. The current interpretation suggests shared financial control. William nodded. That is exactly what our team concluded. Nia shook her head. That interpretation is incorrect. Silence returned instantly. Every person at the table stared at her. Nia tapped the page gently. This phrase does not refer to financial authority. It refers to stewardship responsibility. One attorney blinked. Those are completely different meanings. Exactly. Nia looked toward William. If you sign the contract based on the current translation, both parties will enter the agreement expecting entirely different obligations. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Nobody spoke. William slowly leaned forward. For the first time since meeting her, he was no longer evaluating whether she was qualified. He was wondering how everyone else had missed what she saw so clearly. Across the table, the elderly delegate smiled and said something quietly in his native language. Nia translated without hesitation. He says you are the first person in 3 months who understood what they actually wrote. And in that moment, the laughter that had filled the ballroom earlier felt very far away. The atmosphere inside the Grand Lexington Hotel had changed completely. What had begun as an uncomfortable delay in negotiations was now something else entirely. Executives who had spent the afternoon checking their watches were suddenly leaning forward in their seats. Attorneys who had dismissed the translation problem as impossible were furiously taking notes. Even the foreign delegation appeared transformed. Smiles replaced frustration. Conversations flowed naturally. At the center of it all stood Nia Carter, speaking with the same calm confidence she had shown from the beginning. William Sterling watched her closely. The more she explained, the more questions formed in his mind. Not because he doubted her, because he could not understand how someone with this level of expertise had remained invisible for so long. There is another issue, Nia said, turning another page of the contract. The room immediately grew quiet. One attorney sighed softly. Please tell me it is not worse. Nia smiled faintly. Actually, it is much better. Several people laughed nervously. Nia pointed toward a paragraph near the end of the agreement. Everyone focused on the disputed language here. Her finger moved to another section. But this paragraph is far more important. William glanced at the page. Why? Nia looked toward the delegation before answering. Because this section is not discussing investment rights. A puzzled expression spread across several faces. Then what is it discussing? One executive asked. Nia folded her hands together. Trust. The answer seemed almost too simple. She continued before anyone could interrupt. In the culture where this agreement originated, business relationships are not built primarily through contracts. They are built through demonstrated commitment. This section is essentially a test. William frowned. A test? The elderly representative from the delegation nodded enthusiastically. Nia translated. He says that is exactly correct. The room became silent again. Nia explained that the agreement contained several intentionally complex phrases designed to evaluate whether potential partners understood the values behind the transaction. The delegation was not merely seeking investors. They were searching for long-term stewards willing to respect local communities and traditions. For months, negotiation teams from around the world had focused entirely on financial projections. None had recognized the deeper message hidden inside the language. That is why discussions kept failing, Nia said. Everyone translated the words. Nobody translated the meaning. The sentence lingered in the room. William felt something unexpected. Respect. Genuine respect. Not only for her knowledge, but for the way she viewed communication itself. To her, language was more than vocabulary. It was history, identity, human connection. One of the delegates suddenly asked a lengthy question in his native language. Nia listened carefully before responding fluently. The exchange continued for several minutes. When she finally turned back toward the room, several executives looked completely lost. What did he say? William asked. Nia smiled. He asked whether anyone here understands why their community chose that proverb. And I answered that trust grows slowly and disappears quickly. The elderly delegate broke into a broad smile and applauded softly. Other members of the delegation followed. Soon the applause spread around the table. Not loud, not theatrical, respectful, earned. William remained seated, watching Nia accept the recognition with quiet grace. No victory pose. No attempt to draw attention to herself. She simply returned to her notes. The humility impressed him almost as much as her brilliance. As the meeting finally moved forward, William found his attention drifting away from the contract itself. Instead, he found himself wondering about the woman standing beside it. Who had taught her all of this? Where had she learned languages that most experts had never encountered? And why was someone capable of saving a $3 billion negotiation working quietly behind conference tables instead of leading them? For the first time all day, the contract was no longer the mystery that interested him most. The negotiations continued late into the evening, but the energy inside the ballroom no longer resembled the strained atmosphere that had existed earlier. The foreign delegation and Sterling Global's team were finally speaking with clarity and confidence. Contracts that had seemed impossible only hours before were steadily moving toward agreement. Yet while attorneys revised language and consultants updated projections, William Sterling found himself paying attention to something entirely different. Nia Carter. Long after the most difficult issues had been resolved, she remained focused on helping both sides understand each other. She answered questions patiently. She clarified cultural references. She corrected misunderstandings before they could grow into problems. Most importantly, she treated every person in the room with equal respect. It did not matter whether someone was a billionaire executive or a junior assistant carrying paperwork. Her attention never changed. Near midnight, the final documents were ready for review. As legal teams prepared copies, guests slowly drifted toward the hotel's private dining area for a late dinner. The foreign delegates eagerly invited Nia to join them. To William's surprise, they seemed to trust her more than anyone else in the room. During the meal, conversations flowed easily between multiple languages. Nia moved between them effortlessly, sometimes translating, sometimes simply participating. Several delegates laughed at stories she shared. Others asked her questions about literature, history, and travel. Watching from across the table, William realized something unusual. Nia was not merely knowledgeable. She was respected, deeply respected. The distinction mattered. After dinner ended, most guests departed for the evening. The ballroom had grown quiet. Staff members collected documents and extinguished candles. Through enormous windows, Manhattan glittered beneath the midnight sky. William spotted Nia gathering her notebook and preparing to leave. Before she could reach the exit, he approached her. "I owe you $600, he said. Nia smiled. That was the agreement. William handed her an envelope and an apology. She looked genuinely surprised. For what? For laughing. The honesty of the answer seemed to catch her off guard. For a moment, she simply studied him. Then she accepted the envelope. Most people assume language is easy because they hear it every day, she said. I am used to it. That does not make it right. Nia nodded politely. No, but it makes it predictable. The response lingered in his mind. Predictable. William suddenly wondered how often she had walked into rooms where people underestimated her before she ever spoke a word. Can I ask you something? He said. You can ask. Where did you learn all of those languages? Nia looked toward the city lights beyond the windows. A faint smile appeared. Libraries. William laughed softly. That cannot be the whole story. It is most of it. She explained that her mother had worked multiple jobs while raising her. Money had always been limited. Travel had been impossible. Books became her passport. Public libraries became her classrooms. By the time she reached college, she had already taught herself several languages. Later, she continued learning through scholarship programs, cultural exchanges, and years of independent study. William listened carefully. The story was nothing like what he expected. There were no elite institutions, no privileged upbringing, no shortcuts, just determination. Before leaving, Nia reached into her bag and pulled out a worn paperback dictionary held together by clear tape. The edges were frayed from years of use. This was the first one, she said. William stared at the old book. Somehow it felt more impressive than any award displayed in his corporate headquarters. As Nia walked toward the elevator, William remained standing beside the windows overlooking Manhattan. For the first time all day, he understood why the room had fallen silent when she spoke. It was not because she knew rare languages. It was because behind every word stood a level of discipline, sacrifice, and intelligence that nobody had bothered to see until she made it impossible to ignore. Over the following weeks, William Sterling discovered that forgetting Nia Carter was far more difficult than closing a billion-dollar transaction. At first, he told himself his interest was professional. After all, the successful agreement had attracted attention throughout the industry. Several executives continued discussing the woman who had solved a problem that entire teams of specialists could not. Yet the more William thought about her, the less he found himself focusing on the contract. Instead, he kept remembering small details. The worn dictionary held together by tape. The quiet confidence. The complete absence of ego. One afternoon, while reviewing reports inside his Manhattan office, he asked an assistant a simple question. What do we know about Nia Carter? The answer arrived several days later. The file was surprisingly thin. No major consulting firm. No prestigious corporate title. No public speaking circuit. No social media following worth mentioning. Yet as William read further, a very different story emerged. Nia had graduated near the top of her university class with exceptional academic records in linguistics and international communication. Professors had recommended her for elite fellowship programs. Multiple organizations had offered opportunities that could have launched remarkable careers. Then, almost without explanation, she had declined them. William continued reading. The reason appeared several pages later. Shortly after graduation, Nia's mother became seriously ill. Instead of accepting international assignments, Nia remained in New York. She worked multiple jobs, tutored students, translated documents, assisted community organizations. She built an entire life around responsibility rather than ambition. The discovery unsettled him. In his world, success was measured by expansion, growth, achievement. Nia had measured success differently. She had chosen family. A week later, curiosity led him to a neighborhood in Brooklyn far removed from Manhattan boardrooms and luxury hotels. Following information from the report, he arrived outside a modest community center housed in a renovated brick building. Children's artwork decorated the windows. Colorful signs hung above the entrance. Through the glass doors, he could see activity inside. William stepped into the building and immediately heard multiple languages being spoken at once. Curious, he followed the voices toward a classroom. What he found stopped him in his tracks. Nia stood at the front of the room, surrounded by nearly 30 students ranging from elementary school children to elderly immigrants. Some practiced English. Others studied foreign languages. The atmosphere was energetic and welcoming. Nia moved between groups, offering encouragement and guidance. Every student seemed completely engaged. One young girl struggled with pronunciation. Nia knelt beside her patiently and repeated the phrase until the child smiled with confidence. An elderly man proudly completed an exercise. Nia applauded his progress. Nobody in the room appeared intimidated. Everyone felt valued. William remained near the doorway watching quietly. Eventually Nia noticed him. Surprise crossed her face. "Mr. Sterling?" she asked. Several students immediately turned toward him. William suddenly felt out of place. "I hope I am not interrupting." Nia smiled. "Class is almost finished." He looked around the room. "You never mentioned any of this." Nia glanced at her students. Nobody asked. The answer made him laugh. It was exactly the sort of response he should have expected. As class ended, families arrived to pick up children. Students thanked Nia before leaving. One little boy handed her a handwritten card. Another brought her a drawing. The affection was genuine. Earned. William realized he was witnessing a different kind of success than the one he had spent his life pursuing. And as he watched Nia lock the classroom door at the end of the evening, he began to understand that the most impressive thing about her was not how many languages she spoke. It was how many lives she quietly changed. Several days after visiting the community center, William found himself returning more often than he cared to admit. Sometimes he arrived during classes. Other times he stopped by after students had gone home. He always found the same thing: purpose. The small brick building lacked the elegance of Manhattan boardrooms, yet it possessed something many corporate headquarters never achieved. It mattered to people. One crisp autumn afternoon, William waited until the final students had left before approaching Nia. She was organizing textbooks inside a classroom lined with maps, dictionaries, and handwritten notes in dozens of languages. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting warm patterns across the floor. "You are becoming a regular visitor," Nia said without looking up. William smiled. "I have been accused of worse things." She laughed softly and continued stacking materials. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, William placed a folder on the desk. "I have a proposal." Nia immediately raised an eyebrow. "That sounds dangerous." "Only if you say no." She opened the folder and began reading. The document outlined a newly created position within Sterling Global Investments. International Cultural Strategy Director. Flexible schedule. Global projects. Complete autonomy. A salary large enough to change most people's lives. Nia read every page carefully. When she finished, she closed the folder and handed it back. "No," William blinked. "You did not even hesitate." "Because my answer was already decided before I finished reading." "You are turning down one of the most generous offers my company has ever made." "Probably." William stared at her in disbelief. For years, people had competed for opportunities at his company. Entire careers had been built around obtaining positions less impressive than the one sitting inside that folder. Yet Nia appeared completely unmoved. "Can I ask why?" he said. She glanced around the classroom. Empty desks filled the room. Student projects decorated the walls. A collection of donated books occupied nearly every shelf. "Because everything important to me is already here." William followed her gaze. "You could still help people." "I know." Her voice remained gentle. "But I do not want a bigger title. I do not want a larger office. I do not want people applauding me at conferences." She smiled. "I want that little girl in the front row to believe she can become a diplomat someday. I want the immigrant grandfather who comes every Tuesday to finally feel comfortable speaking English at his doctor's appointments. I want these students to know the world is larger than the neighborhood they grew up in." William had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions with less conviction than she displayed discussing a classroom. "Most people would not walk away from that offer," he admitted. "Most people are not me." The answer left him smiling despite himself. As they locked the building and stepped outside, evening settled across Brooklyn. Streetlights flickered to life. Families walked along sidewalks. Children played basketball in a nearby park. William looked at Nia and realized something important. For most of his life, money had been the solution to nearly every problem. It opened doors, created opportunities, earned attention. Yet standing beside her, he was confronting something it could not buy: purpose, respect, authenticity. And for the first time in a very long time, William Sterling found himself wanting to become the kind of person whose approval mattered to Nia Carter. The weeks that followed brought changes neither William nor Nia could have predicted. After her refusal, William stopped trying to persuade her to join Sterling Global. Instead, he began listening. Really listening. When Nia mentioned that many of her students shared outdated textbooks, New educational grants quietly appeared through charitable foundations. When community programs struggled to afford language materials, anonymous donations arrived without publicity or press releases. Nia noticed the improvements almost immediately. What surprised her was that William never attached his name to any of them. One evening, after finishing a class, she discovered several new computers installed in the learning center. The equipment was modern but practical. No corporate branding. No announcement. No ribbon-cutting ceremony. Just resources the students genuinely needed. "You had something to do with this, did you not?" she asked when William stopped by later that week. He looked around innocently. "I have no idea what you were talking about." Nia folded her arms and smiled. "That is a terrible answer." William laughed. "Then perhaps I should improve my translation skills." The comment earned an amused shake of her head. Their conversations became easier after that. The distance that had once existed between billionaire and translator gradually disappeared. Sometimes they met for coffee after classes. Other times they walked through Brooklyn discussing books, cultures, and experiences that had shaped their lives. William found himself speaking about things he rarely discussed. The pressure of success, the loneliness hidden behind achievement, the constant expectation to always have answers. Nia listened without judgment. In return, she shared stories about her mother, her students, and the lessons she had learned from building a life around service rather than recognition. One Saturday afternoon, William volunteered at a community language fair organized by the center. Families filled the neighborhood park. Children participated in cultural activities. Local musicians performed. Food vendors lined the walkways. Nia moved between booths coordinating volunteers, while William helped wherever he was needed. To the surprise of many attendees, he spent most of the day carrying tables, directing visitors, and handing out supplies. By sunset, he was exhausted. Nia found him sitting on a folding chair beneath a tree. "How does managing a multinational company compare to supervising 40 children?" she asked. William smiled. "The children are more honest." Nia laughed so hard she nearly spilled her coffee. Nearby, several students waved goodbye before heading home with their families. Watching them, William felt something unfamiliar. Contentment. Not the satisfaction of closing a deal. Not the excitement of financial success. Something quieter. More meaningful. As the crowd gradually dispersed, one of Nia's oldest students approached carrying a handmade card. The elderly immigrant handed it directly to William. Confused, he opened it. Inside were simple words written carefully in English. "Thank you for helping us feel seen." William stared at the message for several seconds. The card cost almost nothing, yet it touched him more deeply than awards worth millions displayed throughout his office. Standing beside him, Nia noticed the emotion in his eyes. She did not say anything. She did not need to. For the first time in his life, William Sterling understood that respect could not be purchased, influence could not create genuine admiration, and purpose could not be measured on financial statements. Some lessons arrived through success. The most important ones arrived through people. And as the evening sky darkened above Brooklyn, he realized that Nia Carter had already taught him more than any business school ever could. Nearly a year after the night that changed everything at the Grand Lexington Hotel, William and Nia found themselves standing inside one of the largest international policy conferences in Washington, D.C. Delegations from more than 30 countries had gathered to discuss economic partnerships, educational initiatives, and cultural cooperation. Television crews lined the back of the auditorium. Interpreters occupied glass booths overlooking the main stage. Hundreds of diplomats, executives, and nonprofit leaders filled the seats. Sterling Global was one of the principal sponsors, but William's attention was fixed on something else entirely. Earlier that morning, an unexpected dispute had threatened to derail a landmark agreement between several participating nations. A series of statements made during closed-door negotiations had been translated inconsistently across multiple languages. What began as a misunderstanding quickly evolved into confusion. By noon, frustration spread through the conference halls. Representatives retreated into private meetings. Advisors debated competing interpretations. Reporters sensed trouble. Organizers feared months of preparation might unravel in a single day. Nia had not planned to become involved. She attended the conference only as a guest speaker for an educational panel scheduled later that afternoon. Yet when word of the translation dispute reached her, several delegates immediately requested her assistance. Within minutes, she found herself seated at a long conference table surrounded by officials from around the world. William watched from the back of the room as discussions resumed. Once again, Nia approached the challenge differently than everyone else. Rather than focusing solely on vocabulary, she examined context, historical references, regional expressions, cultural assumptions. Patiently, she asked questions and listened to every side. The process took hours. At times the room grew tense. At times participants seemed ready to abandon negotiations altogether. Through it all, Nia remained calm. Her voice never rose. Her confidence never wavered. Eventually, she discovered the source of the confusion. A phrase used repeatedly during negotiations carried dramatically different emotional meanings, depending on cultural context. What one delegation intended as a gesture of partnership had been interpreted elsewhere as a statement of authority. The difference was subtle. The consequences were enormous. Nia carefully explained the misunderstanding and offered language that accurately reflected the intentions of every party involved. Silence followed. Then one representative nodded. Another agreed. Soon others followed. Within minutes, the deadlock that had threatened the conference began to disappear. Relief spread around the room. Hours later, when the revised agreement was formally presented before the main assembly, applause erupted throughout the auditorium. Delegates stood from their seats. Organizers exchanged grateful smiles. Several officials publicly credited Nia's work for preserving the negotiations. William remained standing near the stage, watching as recognition poured toward the woman who had once been laughed at for requesting $600. The contrast felt almost unbelievable. Yet what moved him most was her reaction. Nia accepted every compliment with humility. She redirected praise toward collaboration. She thanked translators, advisors, and community educators who had influenced her journey. The audience responded with another standing ovation. As the applause filled the hall, William realized he was witnessing something rare. Not simply excellence, not merely intelligence. He was watching a person receive the recognition she had deserved for years. And as Nia stepped away from the podium beneath the bright lights of the international stage, her eyes briefly met his across the room. Neither spoke. They did not need to. Both understood that the story that began with a misunderstood document had become something far greater than either of them had ever imagined. Several months after the conference in Washington, life settled into a rhythm neither William nor Nia would have imagined when they first met. The headlines faded. The interviews ended. New stories replaced old ones in the news cycle. Yet the impact of that day continued spreading through classrooms, community programs, and international partnerships influenced by the work they had helped build. On a crisp spring evening in New York, the community center hosted its annual celebration. Families filled the auditorium. Students proudly displayed projects representing languages and cultures from around the world. Colorful banners decorated the walls. Laughter echoed through the hallways. What had once been a modest local event had grown into something much larger. Former students returned to share success stories. Volunteers reunited with old friends. Parents gathered to celebrate achievements that had once seemed impossible. Nia moved through the crowd greeting students and families. Some were preparing for college. Others had launched careers. A few had become teachers themselves. Watching them, she felt the quiet satisfaction that comes from seeing years of effort bloom into opportunity. Near the back of the room, William observed the celebration with a smile. He no longer felt like a visitor. Over time, he had become part of the community surrounding the center, not through donations or influence, but through presence. He showed up. He volunteered. He listened. People trusted him because he had earned that trust. As the evening progressed, organizers invited Nia to the stage. The audience erupted into applause before she even reached the microphone. Looking across the room, she recognized faces from every chapter of her journey. Students, teachers, neighbors, friends, and standing among them, William. For a moment, she paused. Many years ago, she began, I believed language was about words. The room grew quiet. Then life taught me something better. Language is really about understanding people. Heads nodded throughout the audience. Nia continued speaking about community, opportunity, and the power of being seen. When she finished, the applause seemed to last forever. Then the event director stepped onto the stage carrying a framed photograph. It showed a moment captured months earlier in Washington. Nia stood at the podium while delegates from around the world applauded. Beneath the image appeared a simple inscription, "Because understanding changes everything." Emotion filled Nia's eyes as she accepted the gift. Later that evening, after the celebration ended and families began heading home, she stepped outside into the cool spring air. The city lights shimmered across the street. William joined her on the front steps. For a while, neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable, familiar. "Do you remember the first thing you said to me?" William finally asked. Nia smiled immediately. "I remember asking for $600. They both laughed. "Best investment I ever made," William replied. Nia shook her head. "You still think in business terms." "Not as much as I used to." The answer lingered between them. William looked toward the glowing windows of the community center. "You know," he said quietly, "the most important thing you ever translated was not a contract." Nia turned toward him. "No." William smiled. "It was me." For a moment, neither moved. Then Nia stepped closer. Years of respect, friendship, growth, and understanding seemed to settle gently between them. Beneath the warm glow of the streetlights, she placed a hand lightly against his arm. William leaned forward, and they shared a tender kiss filled not with urgency, but with gratitude and trust. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. Behind them, the community center doors opened and several students immediately spotted the moment. Cheerful laughter erupted from inside the building. Nia covered her face in embarrassment while William laughed openly. Surrounded by the people whose lives had brought them together, they stood beneath the New York night knowing that some of the most meaningful journeys begin with a misunderstanding, a simple conversation, and the courage to truly listen.